Now the man knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have produced a man with the help of the Lord. Next she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a tiller of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruits of the ground, and Abel for his part brought of the firstlings of his flock, their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel in his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. The Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. Cain said to his brother Abel, Let us go out to the field. And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel, and he killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, Where is your brother Abel? He said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said, What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground, and now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Cain said to the Lord, My punishment is greater than I can bear. Today you have driven me away from the soil, and I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and anyone who meets me may kill me. Then the Lord said to him, Not so. Whoever kills Cain will suffer a sevenfold vengeance. And the Lord put a mark on Cain, so that no one who came upon him would kill him. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord, and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Well, the story you just heard is familiar to a lot of us from Sunday school or time growing up in church. Unfortunately, a lot of the details and story beats of the narrative are left behind in such treatments. So today, we're going to take a deep dive into the character of Cain and the story of Cain and Abel. Welcome back to the Plague of Frogs. Alright, first things first. Yes, I am wearing a tie today. And no, the reason for that isn't just to trick Presbyterians into thinking that I'm an intellectual. I also have sinister and malicious ulterior motives for doing so. Secondly, my camera, my recording software, and my microphone have all proven to be so unreliable that I am resorting to filming this entire thing on my iPhone. So if the camera quality and the audio quality are better than usual, that is why. I'm investing in some new software and some new hardware, and hopefully we'll have that going soon, but for the next couple of videos, you're probably going to be seeing me in this format. Finally, I've got something real special for you guys coming up. After this video and the video after it, the weekly videos coming out in sequence are going to be part of a series. There's going to be a 4-part series starting the week after the next one, after the time of this video. And parts 1 through 3 will probably be released concurrently, so one after the other. But part 4 might take a little while after that, just because the subject matter is a little bit more complex. So still looking for recommendations, still looking for suggestions for what to talk about next, but after next week's episode, we are going to start seeing that series roll out. So please do submit your suggestions, submit your recommendations. I can work on those in the meantime because the research phase takes quite a while. So while those other ones are rolling out, I'd be happy to take suggestions on that. So if anybody has something interesting or something uninteresting that they think is cooler than it actually seems to be, feel free to recommend it. I'll see what I can do. All right, back to Cain and Abel. So when a lot of people approach the story of Cain and Abel, they like to isolate the story from its surrounding material. And it makes sense because the story itself is, in a sense, self-isolated. It has a beginning, a plot, and an ending. And so a lot of people will just sort of sever it from its context and try to evaluate what the story of Cain and Abel is all about. But I think that's a little bit of a wrong-headed approach. Not that there's anything intrinsically wrong with it, but I think we'll get a lot more out of this narrative by looking at it in its broader context. The story of Cain and Abel is the story of Genesis, especially the primeval history of Genesis. And when the book of Genesis was collected together, it wasn't collected in an anthological manner. It was collected together into a narrative manner. That's to say, some literary collections in antiquity are anthologies. They're a series of stories in no particular order. You can read one after the other, and it doesn't exactly affect the way that you see the stories interacting, largely because they often don't interact. But Genesis, like most of the Bible, is a narrative. So that means the stories were ordered in a particular fashion. The story of Cain and Abel occurs in the narrative where it does, and not somewhere else. if you dislocate it from where it is in the narrative and try putting it somewhere else, it isn't going to have the same rhetorical effect as it would otherwise. So I think it would be wise when we approach the story of Cain and Abel, as with most other stories, to read it within its broader context. And here's what that looks like. I mentioned that the story of Cain and Abel exists in the book of Genesis, and that's true. It exists as the sequel to the Adam and Eve story and the prequel to Noah's flood story. So keep that in mind as we go on here, because we're going to see Cain and Abel pick up themes from the Adam and Eve story that came before it, and it's going to set up themes that are going to come to their fruition in the Noah story. For anybody who's unfamiliar or who just hasn't read that part of the Bible for a little while, here's a quick rundown of how this part of the Bible looks. These stories exist very early on in the biblical narrative itself. Genesis 2 and 3 are where we find the story of Adam and Eve. God creates Adam and places him in the garden, which is a paradise. He creates Eve and places him with Adam, and that's what happens in chapter 2. Chapter 3 is the grand betrayal. Adam and Eve defy God and act on their own will instead of his, and as a result, they're exiled from paradise and are forced to wander outside of the Garden of Eden. Chapter 4, which takes place immediately after this, is the story of Cain and Abel. As we heard in the beginning, there are two sons born to Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, and after a scuffle and a conflict, Cain kills Abel, resulting in his excommunication from human society. Following this, in Genesis chapter 6, is the story of Noah's flood, where humankind has grown so wicked that God decides it's better to essentially have a reset, wipe everything back to where it was before, and start with a clean slate. So the story of Cain and Abel takes place between these two big pieces of literature, between the fall of Adam and Eve and the judgment of humankind by God with Noah's flood. Now, while the Cain and Abel story does take place between these two stories, the story of Adam and Eve and the story of Noah's flood, and while it's intertwined with them, it has more in common with the Adam and Eve story than it does with the Noah story, especially in form of structure, because the story of God confronting Adam and Eve for their sin plays out almost identically with God confronting Cain for his sin. So the formula that's followed in both of these stories is that the protagonist or the character involved in the story sins against God, they transgress some commandment or another, and then God approaches them, interrogates them about what happened, and then provides a curse that the person has to deal with. Not only this, but the curse inflicted upon Adam and the curse inflicted upon Cain are very similar. For Adam, agriculture became very difficult. The earth would no longer give up its fruit easily, but he would have to work for it. Cain's curse, as we saw in the story, was that agriculture wouldn't work for him at all. The ground would refuse to give up its fruits entirely. So we see not only a similarity in the structural layout of the story, but also in the curses themselves. It's also interesting to note that there is a sort of interesting couplet between Adam's curse and Cain's curse, because with Adam's curse, the ground itself was cursed because of something that Adam did. But with Cain's curse, Cain is cursed because of something that the ground did. The ground opened up to receive the blood of his brother, and as a result, Cain is cursed. But previously, his father Adam transgressed, and because of that, the ground itself was cursed. Finally, the conclusion of these two narratives is very similar in that it sets up improper family dynamics, or a flaw in family dynamics. The curses on humankind in Genesis 3 set up strife between husband and wife, and in Genesis 4, the story of Cain and Abel, we see strife set up between brother and brother. So these two stories are very clearly closely connected. Whoever composed them originally thought that they worked in a pair or as two units very closely associated. But like I said, there is still some connections to Noah's flood, which we'll get to in a little bit here. Like I mentioned a second ago, in the next episode, Noah's flood begins with the idea that humankind has become totally evil and totally depraved. Essentially, every human thought, as the text says, is evil from birth. So clearly, humankind is not in a good way by the time Noah's flood rolls around. But what we're seeing here is that this isn't actually just the spontaneous eneviling of humankind, but it was a gradual process. The first evil act was committed by Adam and Eve, and it was something very minor, just taking the fruit that God told them not to take. Still very serious, but relatively minor compared to where things wind up. In the Cain and Abel story, we see the snowball start to gain speed and momentum, because now we've moved from the subtle betrayal of one of God's relatively minor ordinances to straight up murder. And in the story following up the story of Cain and Abel, the genealogy of Cain, we find that Cain's descendants are even more bloodthirsty than Cain was himself. Following this, we arrive at Noah's flood, which is the situation where all humankind is evil all of the time. So, like I said, we see this sort of snowballing effect, this avalanching effect, starting with a relatively minor sin, snowballing to murder, snowballing to an intensification of murder, snowballing to everyone is evil all the time. So we start to see disaster start from the beginning and make its way all the way through this section of narrative. This is going to be important when we start talking about the moral of the Cain and Abel story, because it's a really difficult question to answer, but I think it's solved best when it's put in its context. So for our purposes right now, it's really important to understand that the Cain and Abel story doesn't take place in a vacuum. And I think if you start looking for the meaning of this story without putting it in its broader context, you're going to start running into issues, because I certainly did. So that's the setting of the story itself. Let's talk a little bit more about the characters. What's interesting about the story is that it's really a story about Cain. We know the story as Cain and Abel is even seen as the protagonist in a sense because he's the righteous one, whereas Cain, being not only a murderer but a fratricide, is the bad guy in this story. That's a totally valid view, but what's interesting is that the story itself frames Cain as the main character, not as the good guy, but a sort of anti-hero or villain in a sense. Cain is the one who's born first. After he's born, his name is given an explanation because Eve receives or acquires a man, and the word there for receive or acquire is kana, which in Hebrew looks very much like the word for Cain, whereas Abel doesn't get any treatment. It just says he's born, there's no explanation of his name, he's just sort of there. He's also simply referred to as his brother, referring to Cain's brother for the most part, suggesting that the focus of the narrative is on Cain and not on Abel. Finally, at the end of the story, Cain himself receives a genealogy, which Abel doesn't. And it's kind of understandable why. It's tough to have a genealogy if you're dead. But the focus of the story seems to be on Cain, whereas Abel is just sort of an implement of the story itself. He's a vehicle for the narrative more than a focus of the story itself. An older generation of scholars once attempted to identify Cain as an archetypal figure. And what they meant by that is a lot of times in Genesis we find that a nation or a people or an ethnic group is identified with a character in the story, and that character's actions or the circumstances around which they operate is supposed to be reflective of the people that were contemporary with the ancient Israelites who wrote the narrative. A great example of this are the Moabites and the Ammonites. These were two nations that lived southeast of the ancient Iron Age kingdom of Israel, and in the book of Genesis, we find the origins of the Moabites and the Ammonites traced back to the sons of Lot, Abraham's nephew. So in these stories, Ammon and Moab are the children of Lot, and they're born through indecent means. And so those indecent means are meant to sort of cast a shadow on Moab and Ammon, and therefore be reflective of the people that they represent as a whole. So essentially, it's sort of a way of evaluating the Moabites and the Ammonites contemporary with the authors of these books by saying, well, let's take a look at where these people come from. Let's take a look at Moab and take a look at Ammon. And yeah, indecent circumstances of their birth. I'm really trying to dance around the details of that story because, boy, it is not a fun one. But they're sort of these figures that stand in the story and are meant to be instructive for how people were to look at the nation that they represent. Another example of this is Esau, the brother of Jacob. Esau was seen as the progenitor of the Edomites, another neighbor of the ancient Israelites. And so some of the details about Esau were meant to be instructive for how the ancient Israelites in the Iron Age viewed the Edomites. So because of that, some scholars have suggested that Cain is another example of this, because there was an ancient group of people south of Iron Age Israel called the Kenites. And the spelling of Kenites and Cain are very similar, just as the spelling of Moab and Ammon is very similar to Moab and Ben-Ammon. So an older generation of scholars suggested that Cain was meant to be an archetype for the Kenites, and that by his murder he was supposed to represent the Kenites as being this barbarian people who would kill for no apparent reason. But more recently, scholars have rejected that proposal, primarily because the Kenites were an ancient people group, but they weren't in contact with the Israelites all that much. They lived close to the Sinai Peninsula and were separated from the Israelites by Idumeans and Edomites. And so it doesn't seem like at this primordial stage of the story, it would make a whole lot of sense to put this relatively innocuous people group here. Other scholars attempted to ascertain the meaning of the name Cain by using homonyms for the word Cain. So in the story, Cain is the name of our protagonist, we'll call him, but the word Cain in several Semitic languages had different meanings as well. So for instance, it was a word for spear in some languages. It was also a word for metal worker in other languages, which actually plays into Cain's genealogy as the father of metal workers. But at the same time, the story actually answers the question for us of what Cain's name indicates about him. Again, when Eve gives birth to Cain, her first son, and ostensibly the first human born in the biblical narrative, she says, "I have received a man with the help of the Lord." And the word for receive, that verb there, is kana. So whether the name Cain had a meaning close to metalworker or spear before the book of Genesis was written down, as the story of Cain and Abel was being told around campfires, there may well have been a connection there, but in the stories we find it in Genesis, it's a play on words with kana, receive. Abel's name is a lot easier to figure out because in Hebrew, the name Abel is actually rendered Hivil. We go through a lot to get the name Abel. It is a whole history. I'll spare you the details of it. But if you open up a Hebrew text of the Bible, you'll find that the name Abel was more properly pronounced Hivil. And anybody who knows a little bit of Hebrew knows a little bit about the word Hivil. So Hivil, for anybody who doesn't know, is the word that we encounter at the beginning of Ecclesiastes. Usually it's translated as vanity, vanity, all things are vanity, or meaningless, meaningless, all things are meaningless. It's a somewhat difficult word to interpret. I think the best interpretation I've come across for what Hivil means is impermanent. And this was the work of Dr. Adam Miglio in his book, Staring into the Deep. I am a little bit biased. I did help edit the book, but at the same time, I think it's probably the best treatment of this term that I've come across personally. So this is actually really interesting if Cain's brother is named Impermanent. That tells us everything we need to know about this character. And remember, Abel, or Hivil, is sort of this plot point. He isn't a true character, really. His function is to get killed by Cain. So the word Hivil is a little bit, awkward, I suppose. I mean, imagine naming your kid that, but for the purposes of the story, it makes perfect sense because it's going to set up Abel's function within the narrative. So now that we've established the characters, let's talk a little bit about the plot of Cain and Abel. It's interesting to point out that Cain is portrayed as an agrarian and Abel is portrayed as a pastoralist. A lot of people have tried to make a lot out of this by suggesting that the story, perhaps in its oral prehistory when it was being passed around over the fire from generation to generation, that perhaps the story was originally about the struggle between institutionalized agriculturalism and nomadic pastoralism. Essentially people who grew crops out of the ground, struggling with people who ran herds of sheep and cows and the like. But what's interesting is that these plot points really don't show up in the story itself. They appear to be somewhat incidental to the narrative of what happens. So maybe these points meant something at some point before the text arrived at its present form, but in the story of Genesis, it doesn't seem that Cain's function as a farmer and Abel's function as a rancher really play into the narrative of the story that much. But it's still interesting, and I thought I'd point it out. It's also interesting to note that stories about feuding brothers are actually somewhat common in the ancient world. So, for instance, we have the story of Osiris and Bata from Egypt, of course. And there's an ancient Sumerian story called the Disputation Between Summer and Winter, where the two personified seasons are siblings and who argue with each other for the approval of their father Enlil. Although, at the end of that story, one of them doesn't kill the other, he just acknowledges that he's actually better. But all the same, feuding brothers are a common literary trope. So let's talk a little bit about the offerings in the story, because this is kind of what kicks everything off and gets the plot rolling. You'll recall that Cain and Abel both offered gifts to God. The Hebrew term isn't for burnt offering, it's for a gift, which can refer to either some form of sacrifice or just a gift given from one person to another. In this context, it seems to refer to a sacrifice, but of an uncertain kind. Now, a lot of us have the memory that when Cain and Abel make their offerings, Cain brings sort of the leftovers of his crops, whereas Abel brings the first fruits of his flocks. Essentially, Cain didn't really try, whereas Abel did, and that's where the difference in God's response comes from. He rejects Cain's leftovers, but accepts Abel's first fruits. But what's interesting is that the text doesn't actually say that Cain brought the leftovers. This is something that people sort of frequently read into the text, because they're looking for an explanation for why God rejected Cain's offering but accepted Abel's. And this isn't anything new either. This interpretation goes as far back as the 4th century with Ephraim the Syrian, possibly quite earlier than that. But the text doesn't give us an explanation for why God accepted Abel's offering but didn't accept Cain's. And that should actually tell us something about the story. If it was important for us to understand why God rejected Cain's offering but accepted Abel's, the story would have told us. In a sense, it kind of doesn't matter. What matters is what's going to come after it with, well, the events that unfold. But the text itself doesn't say why one way or the other. It's just priming us for the conflict in the rest of the story as it rolls out from here. In the first John Wick movie, the thing that spurs John coming out of retirement and thus cascades the rest of the narrative is the fact that John Wick's dog gets killed at the beginning of the movie. Spoiler for a 12-year-old action movie. But what's interesting is that that's sort of an arbitrary decision. It really could have been anything that spurs John coming out of retirement. It could have been somebody looking at him in the wrong way, someone backing into his car, somebody soliciting after hours, and whatever it was, it's kind of arbitrary. It just needs to be something that gets him out of retirement and gets him on the way. And this is kind of a similar situation. What precipitates what comes after it doesn't matter. It was presented as the rejection of Cain's offerings. But it could have been just about anything. Maybe Cain didn't like the way Abel looked at him. Maybe Cain didn't get enough rain one day and got angry. There needs to be something to precipitate the conflict. After the episode of the sacrifice, Cain becomes angry. God comes to Cain and tells him that he should be very careful because sin is lying in wait for him. Now, the language here and what's going on is actually really interesting for a couple of different reasons. So, first of all, there's a linguistic parallel between God's warning to Cain and God's statements to Adam and Eve in the previous chapter. So, in Genesis 3, when God is decreeing the future of humankind, he says regarding Eve that you will desire your husband, but he will rule over you. There's a lot linguistically going on there that I could break down another time, but suffice it to say that in this passage, the wording is almost identical. God tells Cain that sin desires him, but he must rule over it. It seems to be the meaning going on. Again, linguistic difficulties in both, but very interesting parallel all the same. So there almost seems to be this idea that, like, with the attraction of one spouse to another is how intensely sin is waiting for Cain. It is waiting for him. All he has to do is slip up once and it'll have him. So he needs to rule over it. He needs to reject it and essentially strong-arm sin because it's waiting for him. The other interesting thing to notice here is that some scholars have brought up the fact that the verb used for crouching at the door is rabatz. This is interesting because in ancient Mesopotamia, there was an Assyrian demon called the Rabitsu. And so some scholars have suggested that this is drawing on the image of the Rabitsu to depict sin. It's interesting that sin itself here is sort of represented in an anthropomorphic manner. It's capable of crouching. And this isn't making a statement about sin itself, but it's portraying it in sort of a humanoid manner. It might be drawing from the imagery of the Rabitsu. And the placement of a demonic figure or a quasi-demonic figure at Cain's door, remember it's crouching at his door waiting for him, is actually very appropriate as well. In a lot of ancient cultures, this is a topic that anthropologists like to talk about, doorways were seen as liminal spaces, and it makes sense because in a doorway you're neither inside a building or outside a building. You're not inside a room or outside of a room. You're sort of in this chaotic, transitory place. And it's liminal spaces like that it was believed that spirits, demons, and other things of that nature lived and existed. Doorway demons are by no means uncommon in ancient literature and even among some modern mythologies as well. So it seems that the story might be using this term as a play on words to draw on the imagery of a Rabitsu demon in its depiction of sin. Now, it's probably not making a statement about a particular species of demon. It's not acknowledging the existence of a Rabitsu demon or saying that sin itself is a demon with a mind of its own, but it's drawing on this imagery to build upon what we talked about previously, like the desire of sin for Cain. It's so easy to slip into this thing. You must rule over it because it's waiting for you at the door. It's this imagery that's being drawn upon to sort of intensify the depiction of sin and how imminent it is for Cain in this particular instant. And as we see, Cain does not rule over this sin, to disastrous results. I just have Abel dies. It actually really is interesting how little the murder of Abel itself, despite it being sort of the primary crux of the story, is discussed. This is where the conflict leads to and where the fallout comes from, and yet it's described in barely a verse. Not only that, Cain goes out to speak with his brother in the field, but what they talk about isn't actually mentioned. In fact, in later reiterations of the story, later writers would actually supply the conversation, usually putting a philosophical argument between Cain and Abel that is taking place at this time. But the text doesn't tell us what they're talking about. The text doesn't tell us what Cain killed Abel with. Was it a rock, like in most popular depictions? Was it his hands? Again, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what they said to each other. It doesn't matter how Cain killed Abel, because that doesn't matter for the story. What matters is that Cain killed Abel, and that's going to lead us into the next section here, where God confronts Cain. God confronts Cain with the same phrase he confronts Adam with after he sinned. Where are you? God knows where Cain and Adam are. God knows exactly what's happened with the murder of Abel and the biting of the fruit from the tree, but he confronts them, where are you? And so again, we have an interesting parallel between Cain's sin and the sin of his father in the chapter previously. And it's at this point that Cain is cursed by God. Cain's curse, again, is that the land would no longer offer up its fruits to him at all. Again, this is an intensification of his father's curse, that the ground would have to be worked hard to offer up its fruits. But for Cain, no matter how hard he works, the ground wouldn't offer up its agricultural benefits to him. So essentially what this is doing is something of an exile for Cain, because agriculture was the bread and butter of civilized people. When you're herding goats and sheep and cows around the wilderness, you have to move with the animals, or wherever there's green pasture to go with, and as a result, a lot of nomads lived in tents. But agriculture allowed people to stay in the same place year after year after year, because the fields don't move. So for Cain to be chased away from agriculture was to chase him away from human communities in some sense. And when someone's chased away from human communities in the ancient world, there's something of a demonization or liminalization that often happens with them. Humans were defined by the contacts they had in their communities. In fact, some ancients would have believed that a human being bereft of a community wasn't really a human being anymore. They were more of a thing, perhaps more closely approximating animals. We see this a little bit in the story of Enkidu from the Epic of Gilgamesh, where before Enkidu was civilized, he lived as a wild man out in the woods, eating like animals, drinking like animals. We see it in the story of Nebuchadnezzar after he goes mad and flees into the woods and devolves, in a sense, towards this non-human animal-like thing. So while being chased away from agriculture is a bummer, it's more the excommunication from human culture that's going to have long-term ramifications for Cain. Because of this, Cain is rightly afraid, because if people find him wandering around their settlements, they're going to try to kill him. And because look at it from their perspective. You have this man who's unmoored from community, this thing lurking out in the wilderness, who never settles down, who wanders, who probably looks a little bit worse for wear. People like that, drifters especially, are dangerous. And so it's more effective to kill him when they find him than it is to wait for him to come and steal or hurt or kill them. So Cain is rightfully afraid that he's going to be hunted down and killed like the animal he'll become. God responds to Cain's complaint by giving him a mark, or more appropriately, a sign. Popular culture understands the mark of Cain to be some physical characteristic bestowed upon Cain, often depicted as a tattoo or a scar, sometimes on the forehead, given to Cain by God as a mark of his curse. But both of those points are wrong-headed. First of all, the sign of Cain, or the mark of Cain, isn't a confirmation of his curse. It's to protect him from people who would otherwise hunt him down. So the sign of Cain isn't so much something that's meant to warn other people away from Cain. It's to keep Cain safe from other people who want to cause him harm. On top of that, the phrase here for giving Cain a mark is yasem ot, and when this phrase is used elsewhere in the Bible, it usually isn't used to refer to making a mark on somebody or producing some sort of physical characteristic. Usually it's used in the display of some miraculous deed. So for instance, God yasem ot wonders and miracles to Egypt to demonstrate his power and convince them to let the Israelites go during the Exodus. So it seems that what's being depicted here isn't so much a physical mark on Cain's body as it is a promise that God is going to manifest some sign externally to Cain should somebody try to approach him. It is interesting that we actually do have a depiction of a sign being placed on people in Ezekiel 9:4, but the language is completely different. In that passage, it's hitvatatan rather than yasim ot. So we should expect something different to be showing up here in the Cain and Abel story. Now, I mentioned a second ago that the mark or the sign of Cain would be something that God does externally, and again, the story doesn't tell us what that would be. Scholars have speculated that it might be the rumbling of thunder, perhaps the earth which drank Cain's brother's blood would shake and provide a sign in that way, but some way or another, people who approach Cain with malicious intent would be warded off by this sign occurring in nature, or naturally in some regard. Yet again, we find a detail that doesn't make it into the text, what exactly the mark or sign of Cain was. And again, that should tell us that it isn't really important for understanding what the story is talking about here. It's incidental to everything that's going on around it. For a lot of people, this is where the story of Cain and Abel ends, and in a sense that's true. But if we're looking at this as a story about Cain, then this is just the first half of the story, because Cain's story continues. He goes on, he has children, and those children have children, and eventually we wind up with the Noah problem discussed previously. But the descendants of Cain that are mentioned are very important because they're portrayed in the Bible as the first people to build cities. This is super important because in the ancient world, and especially in Mesopotamia and its broader sphere of influence, civilization was seen as something that the gods established for humankind, that this was divinely established. And civilization was what separated humankind from animals. Again, we see some interesting terminology going on there, or symbolism. But what's interesting is that in Babylonian stories and in Assyrian stories, it's the gods who build cities. It's the gods, the divine realm, who bestowed the arts of civilization upon humankind. And in later Jewish writings, like the Book of Enoch, we see these ideas resurge again. Because in the Book of Enoch, or at least in the Book of Watchers, in that story, the first ones to bring the arts of civilization to humankind are the Watchers, these fallen angels who willfully come down to commingle with humankind. But in the Genesis story, this whole narrative is sort of tipped on its head. The first people to build cities weren't these great godlike god kings who were trundling around ancient Mesopotamia. They were wicked men, the children of a fratricide, murderers in their own right. And so there's sort of a pessimistic view of excess of civilization being depicted here. And this is really interesting, but it's persistent with what we see in a lot of ancient Israelite literature from the Iron Age onward. There's sort of a suspicion around civilization that isn't found in other people groups for whom civilization was the great saving grace of existence. A couple points to make about the little Lamech pericope in this part of the narrative as well. A couple things going on here. First of all, the Lamech poem is typically used in Hebrew textbooks on poetry for describing very, very old and archaic Hebrew. This is a really, really old poem, and it betrays signs of being substantially older than perhaps even the book of Genesis that it was composed in. So that's really cool. Second of all, with Lamech and the fact that he's killed multiple people and is threatening compounded revenge over even that promised by God to Cain, we're starting to see, again, the snowball effect. Cain murdered one person. Lamech threatens to murder more people, and eventually humankind gets worse and worse and worse until we arrive at the situation we find with the flood of Noah, where all humankind is evil all the time. So the immediate aftermath of Cain's deed is the murder of one person, but his descendants grow bloodthirsty and evil contaminates humankind until we arrive at the flood story of Noah. And so that's an examination of the plot of the story, but what about the moral of the story? What is this story about? What are we supposed to take away from this? And here I got a little bit stuck, because I was trying to find the moral of the story in Cain and Abel this whole time, but I kept running into an issue. It doesn't seem to announce what the moral of the story itself is. And I got to thinking, maybe it would be a bit too reductive to expect a sort of uniform or monolithic moral from such a complex story. And not only that, but from a story which is a part of a much larger narrative. I think it's probably better to look at Cain and Abel as part of a larger narrative beginning with Adam and Eve going through the Cain and Abel story to the flood of Noah. So Cain's sin picks up what happened in Genesis 2 and 3 with Adam and Eve's sin and compounds on that. And then Cain's descendants in the latter part of this episode compound on that sin as well. And it keeps compounding and compounding and setting a standard for the wickedness of humankind until we arrive at the flood of Noah itself. So taken from that angle, Cain and Abel is less a story in and of itself and more of a part of a larger narrative which serves primarily as a linkage between an earlier story and a story yet to come. It's also interesting to note that the story of Cain and Abel probably had a prehistory before we find it in the book of Genesis. A lot of these stories are very old, quite visibly so, and were probably passed down orally and verbally before they were ever written. So essentially, they were probably passed on from generation to generation around a campfire long before they were written down. And if that is the case, then the story of Cain and Abel may have been told in isolation from the other stories around it long before it was incorporated into the book of Genesis. So it's possible that at one point in time there was a moral of the story. This story was passed down for generations for a reason. It may have had some point of learning to dispatch to the people who were supposed to receive it. But the story as we find it doesn't seem to possess such a moral anymore. Perhaps it's there and I simply wasn't able to find it. But whatever moral there may have been that was intrinsic to the story of Cain and Abel, I think has been supplanted by its work within the broader narrative of the book of Genesis as a whole, and especially in its work linking the Adam and Eve story to the Noah story. So that's the story of Cain and Abel as we find it in our Bibles. But as it turns out, the figure of Cain wouldn't be content to lay resting in his paper tomb for very long. He would continue to inspire later authors either to invoke his character for Cain-like figures, thus becoming the archetype he never was for the Kenites, as well as other authors who would compose legends about the fate of Cain. So we'll review a couple of these for you today and give you some history of the figure of Cain from the biblical times onward. This process would begin almost immediately. Roughly 200 to 250 years after the book of Genesis reaches final form, it would receive a reworking in an apocalyptic paraphrase of Genesis called the Book of Jubilees. This book takes the stories of Genesis and remixes them with some updated theology from its own time. The story of Cain and Abel is preserved almost in its entirety with a couple of minor additions. Why did God choose Abel's sacrifice over Cain's? Answering the questions that a lot of us are still asking today that weren't supplied by the text. But perhaps the most interesting addition is the law of retribution, or the retribution principle, which essentially is the case that Cain is killed by a stone after killing Abel with a stone. Now, this is a detail that the Book of Jubilees supplies. We aren't told that Cain killed his brother with a stone. This is one of the earliest witnesses to the tradition that he did. But the book also supplies the fact that after Cain's life came to an end, he was killed by his house caving in on him, the house made of stones. So there's some poetic irony and poetic justice in Cain being killed by a stone when he killed his own brother with a stone previously. Another afterlife of Cain is found in a document called Targum Pseudo-Jonathan. Targums were Aramaic translations, usually paraphrastic in nature, of the Hebrew text of the Old Testament into Aramaic as more and more people started speaking Aramaic rather than Hebrew. Sort of like translating the Bible into English for people who don't speak Hebrew and Greek on their own. It's a way of making the text more applicable and accessible to people. So when the Hebrew text was translated into Aramaic, we have several different translation traditions. Some of these like to follow the text very woodenly and very closely. Targum Onkelos is a great example of this. Others are a little bit more expansive, with Targum Neophiti perhaps being the most infamous or famous of these. Targum Pseudo-Jonathan expands the story of Cain and Abel by adding an important detail. Namely, in Pseudo-Jonathan, Cain isn't the son of Adam. He is the son of Eve, but his father isn't Adam, but the devil. This is pretty much in line with what a lot of ancients thought about lineage. In the ancient world, it was pretty common to believe that evil men begat evil seed, and vice versa. Also supplied by Pseudo-Jonathan is the topic of discussion when Cain and Abel go out into the field, where Cain then kills him. Remember I mentioned earlier that the details of this discussion aren't mentioned in the Hebrew text because in the core story of Cain and Abel, it isn't important to the plot. But like most people, the ancients were itching to know what they were talking about as well. So Targum Pseudo-Jonathan suggests that when they went out there, Cain was denying the probability of an afterlife and the reward of the righteous, while Abel was saying there is an afterlife and there is a reward for the righteous. And out of envy and jealousy, Cain winds up killing Abel. It seems really unlikely that this would be what two people in that time period were actually talking about, but it actually does make sense in the context of Pseudo-Jonathan. Pseudo-Jonathan, like most Targums, was written at a time when Judaism was undergoing many manifold pressures from the outside and was trying to define itself against a lot of hostile antagonism from Romans, other Jewish sects, and the burgeoning movement called Christianity. So in this time period, we see a lot of hostility proffered against the Sadducees and their descendants. Sadducees, you'll remember if you read the New Testament, were a group of Jewish leaders closely associated with the temple and the priestly family who denied the existence of an afterlife. We find polemics against them over and over and over again in early rabbinic literature. And so this example in Targum Pseudo-Jonathan seems to be a retrojection of this argument into the time of Cain and Abel, with Cain taking the Sadducee opinion and killing Abel, who took the what would have been Pharisaic or rabbinical opinion. So we find a very interesting situation of rabbis, the descendants of Pharisees, putting the words of Sadducees into the mouth of the first murderer. It's also interesting to note that several church fathers refer to a common tradition in their time that Cain was the victim of his descendant Lamech. Lamech talks about murdering people, and a lot of people in the time of the early church apparently believe that the person Lamech refers to murdering is Cain. Most of the church fathers, surprisingly, reject this tradition. They just didn't see it as having any explanatory power, apparently, but it was common in their time, even if it didn't make its way into many texts. Another interesting manifestation of the character of Cain is in the story Beowulf from the Old English period. I actually had no idea that Cain was even referenced in this story, except the fact that a viewer brought it up and mentioned it in the same comment that prompted the production of this video. So, hey, there you go. But it is interesting because in the story of Beowulf, Grendel, the monster, this sort of troll-like figure who's killing and presumably eating people, is referred to as being a descendant of Cain. The same goes for Grendel's mother, which makes sense because that's how families work. But it's interesting that by the time of this story, Cain is no longer just the ancestor of murderers, he's become the ancestor of monsters as well. But if we look at the exile of Cain from human civilization, that fits pretty well, because Cain has become sort of this liminal being. And what are monsters but the ultimate liminal beings? These things that live beyond the bounds of human experience. And so it's actually quite appropriate to have Grendel and his monstrous mother as a descendants of Cain. Whether or not the authors of Beowulf recognized that motif and picked up on it or not, I find it to be a very interesting connection. One last bit of media I thought I'd mention is the poem Cain by Lord Byron, which was written in the 1600s. Typically not a big guy for English poetry. Technically it's a play, I believe. But I gotta say, Byron's Cain is really well written and really well done. I really enjoyed this thing. So I'm not going to go through the whole thing here. I highly recommend that you read Cain, a Mystery by Lord Byron. But some of the interesting things, like it's clearly a product of its time, right? Like the author clearly read Paradise Lost by John Milton. The character of Satan as it shows up is Milton, Satan, not usually the devil of the Church Fathers or the Bible. But it's a really, really well-written, really articulated story. But the funny thing, I found this super humorous because at the beginning of it, to set up Cain's character, Cain, Abel, Adam, Eve, and Adam and Eve's daughters are coming to make their offerings to God, and they're all praying and they're praising God, and Cain stays silent. And his characterization here is like a kid who doesn't want to go to church on Sunday morning, and I could relate to that so much, and I thought it was hilarious. But it gets even better because Cain, the reason Cain is upset and kind of what leads to the rest of the narrative happening is because he didn't ask to be born, and it's because of his dad that everything has fallen apart. So he didn't ask to be born and he hates his dad. And it's just kind of like, that is a very, like, get Sigmund Freud in here, that's a very modern-esque depiction of an antagonist or of a character in a story. I found it very funny. It's a very well done and very serious poem, and I think if you pay attention to some of the broader themes, you'll be really amazed by what you find there, but I'm not going to spoil it for you. Go read Cain by Lord Byron, find emo Cain sulking in his room and eventually murdering his brother, and come back to me after you've done that. Oh yeah, Shakespeare mentions in The Merry Wives of Windsor that someone has a cane-colored beard. This is because in a lot of artwork, especially during the Renaissance period, Cain, the murderer of his brother, and Judas, the betrayer of Jesus, were both portrayed as having red hair, which was somehow indicative of their evilness. In fact, I have a painting of the Last Supper here, and the only redhead you'll find there is Judas. He's the one in gold, kind of sulking off on the right there. So, as a redhead, I can affirm that yes, we are all descended from Cain, and yes, we do not have souls. Next question. And that's about all I have for you today. So your assignment is to reread the story of Cain and Abel if you'd like to, and definitely check out Cain by Lord Byron, because I think it's actually a really fun read. It's a little bit dense, but it's not particularly long, so I highly recommend that. But seriously, thank you for sticking with me through the entire video. I really hope this was enlightening. Hopefully we touched on some interesting points here. Like I said, the next couple of videos I already have planned out. So the next one's going to be a one-off that should come out next week. And then the 4 following that are going to be part of a continuous series. Don't want to spoil too much of it, but I think you'll get what I'm going at once they start coming out. Like I said, part 4 is a little bit unique, and so that might have to come out at a later time, but from where I'm looking at things now, parts 1 through 3 should all come out one after the other contiguously. I do have some ideas for some shorter, more pop culture based videos to make in the meantime as well. Especially I want to explore the figure of Superman and some of the Christian imagery that's baked into him, because I think that's really interesting. But in the meantime too, if anybody has some interesting ideas for what they'd like to see discussed, things in the Bible, things in broader religion in general, or things in popular culture that sort of appeal to a religious audience or have this sort of religious feel around them, please let me know in the comments. Like, seriously, let me know what you want to see me talk about. I'd really appreciate some insights, because honestly, I have so many cool things I could talk about and so many probably less cool things to talk about that I don't know what you guys want. So please do let me know. Thanks so much again for sticking around. Take care of yourselves, and I hope I see you all next time. Have a great day.